Take control of your global business with the 7th edition FitSkills online program. The world's leading export-import training gives you the edge you need to compete in the international marketplace. Gain access to leading-edge tools and resources that will accelerate your career and business trajectory. Get real-world training designed by business for business to enhance your global credibility and expertise. Learn more and sign up to get your global business advantage.
All right, so welcome to the SC, the Trade Squad on YouTube. I am Sarah Barnes-Humphrey. I am here with Leah, Irina, and Audrey, and we are so ready to debate the hot topics in this first episode. And so I think maybe we should just get started, unless maybe we should, just go around the room and just introduce ourselves. Why don't we start with you, Audrey?
Okay. I'm Audrey. I'm here in Toronto, Canada. I work for a private labeling company that does beauty, cosmetics, and baths. So it's all consumer goods. Orchard Custom Beauty kind of operates around the whole world. So I'm shipping back and forth between, kind of South Asia to Europe, Europe to US, Canada to US, stuff to Australia, all over the place. So keeps me busy.
Awesome. And Leah?
Hi, I'm Leah Goold-Haws. I am here in Long Beach, California, and I am currently the statewide director for the California Community Colleges Chancellor's Office, which runs a business services network called the Centers for International Trade Development, or CITD, and we provide consulting for small business looking to export overseas.
Awesome. And last but not least, we have a superstar guest with us today, and that's Irina. Irina, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Definitely. Sarah, you always know how to flatter me. Great. So hi, everyone. Irina Rosca saying hello from San Diego. I am the Director of Global Supply Chain Operations for Helix. It is a human genome genomics company. We operate in the direct-to-consumer marketplace, which is super exciting, while also very highly regulated by different regulatory bodies within the United States. My background is really in global supply chain management, anywhere from wine and spirits, consumer packaged goods, and obviously now consumer genomics. I also run Sustain SCM, which is a supply chain blog focusing on education in global supply chain practices. So I hope this is an interactive conversation.
Absolutely. Well, let's get started on the debate. I mean, we have a couple of really good topics here that I think everybody is going to be able to, relate to and probably have some of their own opinions on. So we're going to start with the topic of cash versus process, because I've had a lot of really big discussions with different people about companies that have a supply chain that are cash rich, and they're not so focused on the process, the supply chain process. And some people are, very concerned about that, because being cash rich doesn't necessarily mean that we should, snub the supply chain process that's so important to our business strategy. So I'm just going to go over a couple of good reasons for cash and bad reasons for cash, and then we'll get into sort of the process and why it's so important. So some of the good reasons is investors like it because it shows good company performance. Bad reasons is, high levels of cash signal danger ahead. Why isn't the money being put to good use? So Irina, let's talk a little bit about that cash versus supply chain process. Why is that process so important?
So I think that one of the most important things to understand, or at least from my perspective, is that when I have found that organizations have a good retention of cash, is where the processes just don't exist. And so I wouldn't necessarily isolate that to supply chain alone. While that's been my experience personally, I found that organizationally, standard operating procedures just don't exist, which then create larger issues in terms of, benchmarking and really understanding where should you put that cash to improve. Because if you don't know where the problems are, because you don't know where your benchmark is and what your benchmark for improvement is, then you don't really understand what the return on specific investments should be. Now, as it particularly, applies to supply chain, it's important because if you don't really have an understanding of how your supply chain is managed, and specifically how to improve relationships with suppliers so that you can drive down costs and eliminate some of the risks, especially in a global supply chain, and you're just, like we like to use in this industry, is throwing cash at it, then that's really all you're doing, is you're putting patches on a much larger problem and potentially ignoring some areas of improvement or huge areas of risk because you don't really know what it should look like.
Yeah, I was going to say that risk is a pretty important factor of that on many different levels, right? With inventory, having access versus managing the inventory levels properly, plus inaccurate inventory data, right?
Absolutely. And, it's, if we're just accepting, right, if we're, so personal example, I've worked for organizations that just accepted inventory write-offs as part of daily business because while it impacted the bottom line, it didn't necessarily, to your point, impact the way that investors looked at the state of the business because there was enough cash flow, the financial metrics were okay, but the supply chain metrics were not, right? And so there was never that approach of let's really understand how to service the customer, let's understand how to forecast better, let's understand, how to manage the supply chain part of the business better so that maybe we can do something more impactful with the cash.
Yeah, and they're losing out on using the supply chain as a competitive advantage, I think, right?
Absolutely. Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that's that's an understatement, but yes.
Audrey, did you have anything to add? No?
It's just not where, I mean, you don't want to lose the money, right? And like we do this here where there's, you think it's just such a little bit. So you kind of keep writing things off, or you kind of keep letting things slide and not having that conversation. And really it does add up. Like if you were to stop and think like, okay, every time, oh, it's just $2. Oh, it's $50. It's $150. Well, what's your limit?
Yep.
How can you decide, okay, everything less than 1,000, we just really don't care about, but you're like, how many projects is that? How many pieces of inventory is that? And then so it does really add up.
Absolutely. I think so. When I was doing the research for this, I went through an APQC study, and it said something about 11% difference between top performers and bottom performers for companies with $5 billion in revenue. And what that equaled out to was $540 million in inventory carrying costs.
Oh.
Yeah,
that's a lot of money.
But again, if you don't know what that should be, because you're not benchmarking against the industry or even against yourself from years past, then you're just accepting it as a cost of doing business.
Yeah,
right?
and
process and without a KPI that you can track, then that just becomes a standard, the standard of acceptance. And again, like the people who are looking at your cash flow versus the people who are looking at where your cash is tied into sometimes tend to be separated. And so if the financials are good, oftentimes you're not pushing for the right stuff.
Right.
I mean, there's definitely, exceptions to that, but a lot of companies can't get out of their own way when they get stuck in this really bad feedback.
That is a really good way of saying it. Nicely.
I've done it a few times.
Well, and so I guess my question to you ladies is visibility the answer? And what does that look like in process? Because everybody talks about visibility, right? Visibility in the supply chain. And I know visibility versus process might not be exactly the same thing, but a lot of people think visibility is that answer to supply chain.
So I don't think that visibility is the answer, but visibility is the answer for me, right? Because I'm leading the supply chain. Yeah. My job then becomes to manage the visibility and take that information and tell a story that makes sense to other stakeholders to improve the business. If I just have visibility and I don't take all of that information, that intelligence to empower other business units within my organization to align on the same story, then that doesn't help anybody. So I've spoken about this in a few different presentations where it's not just about the visibility, it's about the connectivity. Like, how do you take that visibility and connect the enterprise around a goal?
Right.
And the goal doesn't have to be supply chain related. That's just one facet of what we're trying to improve. Maybe the goal is to have stellar customer experience. Well, that's a huge part of it.
Mm-hmm. And supply chain is a big part of that customer experience,
Absolutely.
which is a really good segue into our next topic. So we're going to be talking about e-commerce and pressures on global supply chain. I know that this one is close to Leah's heart, and something that, you know, you really want to talk about and debate on today. But I think the one thing that I'm going to say before we jump into this is that Amazon effect has created so many new expectations, so many new pressures on companies, supply chains, you know, with free deliveries, free returns. So where do we go from here? What does it mean for businesses? What are you seeing, Leah?
Well, it's interesting because I think it ties into everything that's just been mentioned, to Irina's point around wanting to be transparent, but also this misinterpretation about being cash flush and the health of your company. And what does this mean for a smaller business in terms of how they compete against the appearance of these larger firms like the Amazons, Google, Facebook, et cetera, who seem to have this advantage. And for smaller businesses, I think it's really about investing in systems that provide transparency and efficiencies and allow companies to, where possible, leverage relationships with some of these bigger suppliers that allow them to tap into something that, you know, to your point, is going to get more and more complex. When we look at what's happening in the China market, consumer demand is driving expectations that are increasingly more challenging. And that has, you know, reverberations across all kinds of things, from its impact on the environment to, you know, what's feasible in terms of mitigating risk when you look at your global supply chain. So a lot to take into consideration, yet all of this stuff really does tie together.
Absolutely. And anybody else want to jump in here? I mean, I was kind of, when I was doing my research on this, I was thinking about it as sort of like a pressure cooker. You know, like, when will this whole thing combust? Because it almost seems like, you know, pressure upon pressure of having to do free delivery and free returns. And, you know, is there an end, or are we just going to keep going?
Yeah. I mean, if I can just add, you know, I was doing some research on this topic as well. There was a German company that has partnered with the Hermes supply chain, and the reverse logistics is one of the biggest challenges, right? Because customers expect a level of ease of return that isn't always feasible. And so this company in Germany had partnerships where you could drop something off or pick up at gas stations, newsstands, sort of unconventional locations. But again, it's leveraging those partnerships that really may become the only way smaller firms can in this space.
And just to pick up where what Leah just said, we actually saw, not just in a smaller business case, but we've seen that work out for Amazon perfectly, and Kohl's, right? So Amazon and Kohl's essentially just went and did the exact same thing, and there's been a huge return on that investment from the Kohl's perspective. So, you know, Kohl's is a regular brick and mortar. They weren't doing so hot just based on what the rest of the marketplace is doing. And now they're getting actually more foot traffic because people are going to return their Amazon packages at a Kohl's location and sometimes walking out with another good that they purchased. So I hope that e-commerce isn't going away because, or not going away, but I hope that this conversation isn't going away because honestly, this is what makes my job super exciting. I think that e-commerce, like big box retail is great, but honestly, e-commerce is what keeps you up at night. It's what thinking this environment is super exciting.
So then maybe those pressures are kind of alleviated with new thinking.
Yes. And I think that, I mean, that was a great point about partnerships because it's forcing us to think about a more inclusive environment in
collaboration. Collaboration is the future of business. I love that. I love that. But, and I guess more to your point, I was talking to somebody else the other day and we were talking about how, you know, Walmart has turned into distribution centers.
Yep.
People are ordering online and all the employees are in the store pick and packing the orders.
Yeah.
You know, like, is that where we're going?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting too is that maybe historically, as larger brands have moved into foreign markets, there was always this expectation that the brand would lead the experience. And what we're seeing through e-commerce is really the customer driving that experience. And so it becomes an interesting way to leverage these partnerships, because if I want to move product into India, regardless of what the brand is, I have to understand that Indian customers' expectations around an e-commerce shopping experience. And if it's not only more convenient, but perhaps more meaningful to do my shopping and then pick up my e-commerce order from my grocery store, that's an insight that we're going to have to be increasingly aware of. But again, exciting if you look at it from the right angle.
Yeah, I was having a discussion though, like it's kind of, and this may be off topic a little bit, but it's overwhelming.
Yep.
Like if you're not a large enterprise company, how are you even doing this? Because I was talking to somebody that wanted to start importing and exporting. And I started talking about, the different things that you need to think about in supply chain. And, you have to have that supply chain mindset when you're building your business and all this kind of stuff. And I think I completely overwhelmed them. Like by accident. I didn't mean to. But like it was like deer in the headlights. Like
totally terrify you, but I did.
That's where partnerships come into play, right? So that's really where you have to be able to depend, on your partners. And yes, do you need to, and I actually honestly love this, because then it does force organizations to think about supply chain far earlier on.
Yes.
I can't think how many times I've walked into an organization that's been, around for 10, 15, 20 years, and you're like, okay, well, what do you guys do in terms of supply chain? And people look at each other and they have no idea. So it's like, well, maybe now, think about supply chain in year 3, if not, at the very beginning.
At the very beginning. I am all for at the very beginning.
Yeah. But it's just, I feel that it used to be one of those business units that was just like, oh, we'll think about that when we want to optimize. And it's like, no, because you're not going to get off the ground unless you think about it now.
A cost center, right? That's all we were thought about was a cost center. And now they're hiring CEOs.
Or they're going to ask us for money.
And they're hiring CEOs with supply chain backgrounds. Take that.
Finally, yes. Yes, I'm so excited. Not just that, but at least have a chief supply chain officer. Nobody's arguing that the CEO needs to come from, right? Because you're building relationships, and maybe we're not seen as the relationship building type of business unit yet. But I do think that supply chain needs to have a high leadership seat at the table. And no, I don't believe that supply chain should be under the operations umbrella anymore.
Right. What are you seeing, Audrey?
A lot of the same things, and just really when entrepreneurs want to get started, when small businesses want to get started, just making sure they are making those considerations. It seems really easy, like, I'll just use, Canada Post or DHL, UPS, whoever. I'll just send it overseas, no big deal. And they're really not making themselves aware of kind of all of the implications or compliance issues that they're actually responsible for as a business. So, you don't want to see these, there's a lot of excitement around their product. It's innovative, it's ingenious. And then you just don't want to see them get stuck with like some customs audit or supply chain issues where their supplier, when they start to scale up, just can't handle it, or something happens overseas. Like, you just don't want to see all of these kinds of hard issues that really there's learning around that. There's people you can ask. Like, it's not necessary that you have to go through this really challenging experience. There are resources to help you.
Don't talk to Sarah.
Yeah, yeah, it is. There is a lot. There's a lot, but there's people to help you. And it's like, sometimes entrepreneurs feel it's like, oh, I've got to learn everything and do everything. And, but it's, exactly what we're all talking about. Leverage those partnerships, have those collaborations, and make sure you're not isolating yourself as like, oh, I'm the business owner, I've got to stay in my home office and like make this happen. It's like, you got to get out and meet people. You got to talk to peers. You got to talk to other people who are doing this. There's a lot of information at your fingertips, so you can take care of a lot of things by yourself. But it is kind of good to check in and see where other people can offer you some of those, like, ooh, I went through this really horrible experience. You don't have to. Here's how you avoid it.
Don't do that.
Yeah, don't do what I did, please.
Well, you bring up a really good point, because I think with e-commerce, we rely heavily on certain companies, right?
Mm.
And one of those is the post office.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you guys know Irina and Leah, but just recently before Christmas, our Canada Post went on strike.
Mhm.
All hell broke loose.
Yeah.
And people did not get their Christmas presents.
Yeah.
And like kids were left without Christmas presents that were ordered because there was such a backlog once they did go back to work. And I've talked about this before on the show, but there's really no alternative, or like an affordable alternative. Like, what do we do? You know, we've got to figure that part out of it as well, because, you know, DHL, UPS, FedEx, fine, they're there, but they're probably 3 times more expensive than the post office. Right? So what do we do if we're relying too heavily on the post office?
Right, you guys have a very peculiar problem in terms of transportation up there. Just given the amount, like the vast amount of space, right? That
Yes.
that the transportation facility, like it's a lot, right? So I've had those conversations many a times. I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of opportunity for some new market entry. And some out of the box thinking around this. I was aware that happened. You know, when families put pressure on the system, that generally tends to get things moving and the wheels turning because money's spent. So I'm hoping that come, you know, next holiday season, there's a new solution. But I do know that the transportation challenges in Canada are peculiar because there's so much space to cover.
I would say the same for there's quite a few, like Australia too. Australia has been a real challenge with, you know, it's just a huge geographical area, and you just don't quite realize that they don't have, you know, because of some of the landmarks and you know, physical location, you just can't get through. They just didn't build roads kind of across. They built everything around, so it takes a lot longer. And I'm sure like China has that, you know, where you're air shipping a lot more stuff than you are sending it by truck or train. And there's huge considerations for transport and logistics everywhere.
Yeah, and the last point I kind of wanted to bring up in this whole e-commerce and pressures on global supply chain is the next generation. So some of the conversations I've had is around the next generation wanting customizable products.
I love that.
I love it too, but what does it mean? Does it mean that, you know, warehouses and companies are going to start having 3D printers? Because, you know, if you do customized overseas, it just takes too long and people don't want to wait for it, and then you lose a customer. Does it mean that we're going to, you know, start shipping raw materials then instead of finished goods? Like, what is that going to do to the supply chain?
Upend it?
I think that first and foremost, it's going to, you know, push us to actually stop throwing our hands up in the air and saying, well, the forecast is always wrong. And at least force us to actually implement better forecasting and demand planning strategies that allow us to really, and not by us, I don't mean just the organization, I mean empower the supply chain team to touch the end consumer and allow for us to learn from them. Because, I mean, to your point, and then, you know, there's going to be a subset of products that cannot be customized overnight, right? So we will educate the consumer.
Is there?
Educate us back.
Is there really? Because at this point,
and actually on one of your episodes, Sarah, somebody talked about their kid who wanted to buy a pair of Nike shoes, and the customization was going to take 4 weeks, and so they decided not to buy them.
Right.
Well, I don't know that there is another company who is going to provide the type of quality that Nike provides in terms of the shoe with the customization that they want. And so in that situation, that consumer either doesn't get what they want, which the next generation is not going to be happy with.
Yeah.
So in that situation, they'll probably just, or we expect that some level set of expectations will occur, or we hope.
Yeah. Or as of right now, until we figure it out, you're either going to have to wait the time or forego the product.
Exactly. Which I don't know that it makes anybody happy, right? So I see a landing somewhere in the middle. But first and foremost, it has to force us to get closer to the consumer and understand what they want, when they want, and how can we get it to them.
Supply chain teams and marketing teams forever.
First, we got to get supply chain and marketing to talk to each other.
Yes, that's a good point. Leah, are you seeing any of this? Are they talking about like 3D printing, customization?
Well, I think one of the things that, comes up in this space around that topic is the idea in terms of how it impacts the workforce. What is the next generation of the workforce going to have to know? I've certainly seen examples, and this is a relatively new technology, where 3D projections, if you will, are sent over to the manufacturer so that they're able to see in real time how to assemble different, components. And it's a really interesting model for how consumers might eventually customize their own product. There's always a fear that these technology disruptions, if you will, are going to eliminate work. But I think this discussion really highlights the fact that this is just creating new types of work and new jobs, and really exciting. I think to Audrey and Irina's earlier point around small business and e-commerce and being aware of your supply chain concerns early on, for smaller companies, I think there was a point in time when supply chain was a cargo container consideration. And anything other than that was outside of their realm and what they could take to the post office, which touche, Canada Post, for making your point well understood with the Christmas time strike. But I think it's really interesting now that what Irina just mentioned is so true. It's the supply chain is moving closer and closer to the consumer. And I think that's a good thing on a lot of fronts, but also because the consumer suddenly weighs in on that reality. And I think we're going to see that continue to expand and grow. And again, I think it's a really exciting thing, but I think it could be uncomfortable for a bit of time.
Yeah.
Good. Let's get uncomfortable. And you guys are just doing amazing with these segues, because the next conversation and the next hot topic is reshaping the future of work, which I think is a huge topic right now. Everybody's talking about talent shortage. Where do we find talent? What do we do about talent? I've even mentioned, making sure you have a technology background, somebody with technology background in your supply chain team, because of so many platforms that are coming out, and, how do you navigate it? So one of the articles that I was reading, it's a Fast Company article by Stephanie Casriel. They were talking about the younger managers, reshaping the future of work by making a workforce plan a priority, investing in new tech and supporting remote positions. So what do you guys think about that? I mean, we've got AI and machine learning coming up, and it's scaring people. Where's our jobs going to go?
I don't think that's a problem so much, because I think that Leah actually already made the point of, we're actually just moving mundane processes to towards more value-added processes. I actually think that most employees would value, when positioned correctly, most employees would value that challenge. But I would say that I do want to address one point before we move forward on this conversation about talent and managing supply chain talent. The one thing that I have found in both, interviewing for different positions and also trying to find talent to hire within my own teams, we as supply chain professionals and as hiring managers have not done a very good job of really explaining to human resources what it is that we mean when we put a job description out there.
Ding, 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 ding.
Hey!
So we do not empower the people on the front lines to really go through the interviewing process, which properly, and position the right candidates in front of us. And so what ends up happening is we end up writing off candidates that could be fantastic. I can't tell you how many times I've gone back and pulled candidates out of pools that HR said no to. And that's actually happened to me, where I've been said no to, and then the hiring manager for the position actually came back and said, no, that doesn't, because it's mainly because it's hard for them to understand what our lingo means.
Yeah.
So we need to do a better job of aligning with human resources as well.
So human resources and supply chain need to talk.
That happens, yeah.
In addition to that, not only do HR and supply chain need to talk, but then we're talking about the education side of the house. Because what I've been working with, there's 114 colleges in the state of California. But if you were to visit, I would say 99% of those campuses and ask faculty, what are the skills we should be training for in supply chain management positions? A, they have no idea, and B, they're not even sure what to call those jobs. So think about it from a student perspective. You know, when a student gets out there and starts looking for employment, it's incredibly important that that conversation is had with education, with industry, and then really setting parameters and defining what are these roles. And they're going to be changing, like we just described. We may not even have names today for the jobs of tomorrow, but there are certain skills and proficiencies that we really need to point to.
Do you know what some of those skills are? Have you come across that in some of your research?
Well, I would say there's all kinds of industry credentialing agencies that do a pretty good job of outlining some of the foundational skills. And I think that's a place where we usually start in terms of pointing faculty to how to get their programs off the ground. And then we want to bring industry folks into the classroom as frequently as possible. I think sometimes our industry partners don't understand how critical they are in this space, because if you leave it up to faculty to define, their world is in academia and they do an excellent job, but they need support to stay abreast of how the industry is changing, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in my research that I did, it actually said that, because we were talking about reskilling, so maybe not students, but reskilling workers. And a lot of people think that it's up to the company to reskill. But a lot of other people were saying that it must be a collaboration between companies, government, and academia.
Yeah. I mean, I do want to, and when it comes to reskilling, right, the one thing that you would do is you would go to APICS or CSCMP or whatever other major organization that was out there, and you would say, hey, you know, I want to get better at supply chain logistics or whatever it is, and I would like to get this certification. I think Leah made a fantastic point when it comes to the fact that those certifications and the material that you're learning is put together by academics. And if I'm sure that all of you have come across these instances where that information is so far removed from reality that you actually sometimes going through those certifications feel like you have a second job because you're learning stuff that you're never applying on a day-to-day basis. And then the worst part about it is that when you're going through the testing, it's not even using your critical thinking. The questions are actually taking information word by word from the book as if that is how reality works. And so I'm not placing blame. I'm just saying, to Leah's point, as an industry, we haven't done a good enough job to say, you're teaching this. This is how it applies in the real world. So in a testing environment, let's think about it this way rather than just regurgitate information. I mean, that didn't work when we were in 8th grade. Why should it work when we are professionals in an ever-changing industry?
Yeah, and I think one quick point to that is we've got so many associations in supply chain. I mean, let's be honest. There's a lot of associations. I've spoken to a lot of people that have said, listen, these associations need to consolidate because there's only so much money to go around. Yeah. But like you said, they're so far removed from the academia and what people are learning. So why are they not all, I just don't understand why they're not all looking to each other and working together, and then also working with the schools to make sure that the talent that comes out of the schools is going to be worthwhile, like for both parties.
Yeah.
Am I wrong here? Sorry.
No, I think you're right on. Although if we could get everyone to come together in so many areas in life.
All right, good point.
But you know, it's interesting because like we were talking about at the beginning of the segment, and Irina was talking about, you know, companies that are cash flush and how do you apply those funds in ways that better impact your supply chain, and certainly upskilling is a part of that. And I think that's one thing that a lot of industry partners don't recognize, at least here in California, that the college system is set up to have sort of one-off short-term contract education, we call it, specifically customized for industry needs. And that's a place where those partnerships that you are hoping for, Sarah, can actually come to fruition. We can bring in a credentialing partner, we can bring in an industry partner, and then bring in academia. And with those three together, craft short-term upskilling training, if you will. And especially when supply chain company is bringing in, say, new software, and they want to get everybody trained up on how to use it and be efficient, that's one of the ways that we can be useful.
Awesome. I love that. Going back to reskilling for a second, I mean, one of the reasons why I brought that up was because AI and machine learning, I read that it's going to displace 1.4 million workers. And that reskilling is going to cost $25,000 per employee, which is $34 billion. Just to put that into perspective as far as numbers are concerned. But what they said was that it's cheaper to reskill than recruit, hire, and train. And that it'll be more valuable than a college degree.
That makes sense. That makes sense. It's always customer.
True, but that's also if you're assuming that you're implementing AI across board all at once, and that you're pulling, that you're having to rescale the entire workforce all at once. And so I guess it's assuming that everything's happening in a vacuum, all other things being equal. And I don't think that I fully agree with that.
Okay.
When you implement AI, you're kind of learning as you're going. You don't always have to step out, stop what you're doing, and go learn something brand new. So it's I think that's a very narrow-minded way.
I will tell the author.
Tactic, if you look at it from that perspective, because I think that a lot of people use those statistics as reasons why not to go down an improvement path.
Okay.
Which is a little bit scary as a professional in this world.
That is a little bit scary. Well, one of the other things that they brought up was that the next generation likes to be freelancers.
Likes to be, or has no choice in that?
So it says that one of the solutions is to become a freelancer, and it says over 40% of millennials and Gen X are freelancers by choice because they're taking their own training and they're more innovative that way. And more companies are hiring them.
But I think it's because they've had to be, because no one's putting money into training. They all want them to have 15 years of experience before they get their first job.
Yes.
Yep.
They've set the stack against, now I'm an elder millennial, but they've set the stack against like the next generation that's coming kind of after millennials, because millennials are now more into their 30s and then like young, I love, my first job. But, like I think I'm with Irina. A lot of that stuff, it's like, if you're applying everything across the board, there's like an immediacy, like immediately we're moving to AI and you have no choice but to do, like, that's not how it works. Everything comes in sort of, yes, quickly, but gradually, like there are different stages to things happening. But I would disagree with millennials, like, I love being freelance and not being able to pay my rent because companies have no money for training and have no thinking as to, I'm an employee who started and I'm in this role. And like, I think I've had some great experiences here at Orchard. I started out in an entirely different role than what I'm in now. And we have, a lot of people here have been given the opportunity to move to different roles and try out different positions. Whether it's like, even now we have a buyer who's going to take on project management covering a mat leave, like giving that, in-house kind of education and learning experience. And then when you can take it bigger, like to Leah's point, and have it, have that support from academia and outside partners and helping you to get your employees trained. But the biggest number is always firing someone and trying to hire for the position versus training your in-house staff. Like the cost is just, it's notable.
Yeah, and I would hope that actually this points to the need for expanding the definition of not only training, because traditional education and traditional degrees, I think, are only one avenue to get the education and learning you need. I think more and more people are looking from online, avenues in terms of augmenting their skill sets, but also, if indeed more folks, millennials or otherwise, want to be remote, remote workers, special nod to Canada, and your healthcare probably makes that more enticing. But yeah, you know, I think that means we have to look at how we collaborate in the work environment generally, because there's always a need for that entrenched knowledge to be alongside the new disruptive technologies.
Mhm.
And if we can see how those two pools of employees, if you will, work together, I think that would make the supply chain even more efficient and advantageous.
Just the
Right.
healthcare? Okay, I don't want to get into politics. I'm not getting into politics, but I had to ask.
We'll leave it there.
All right, so the next hot topic is tariffs. I think that we've seen, you know, a lot of moving and shaking in this area. I know this one is something that's true to Audrey's heart, so I will send it over to you. I mean, we don't really want to get into trade agreements per se, but I think just talking about tariffs, like, is there any use for them really? I think, you know, with next generations coming into the industry, they're kind of questioning everything.
Yeah.
So, you know, why do we need tariffs? And when I was looking into it, one of the definitions I came across was really to fund the government, taxes on imported products paid by importers, and I guess on the other side of the coin, it said to protect industry as well. So Audrey, take it from here.
Well, it's protecting which industries, though? It's protecting the industries that came together and grouped together to lobby the government to put tariffs into place in a lot of situations. So you're paying for these tariffs. You want to import a foreign product, and it's like, oh, it has tariffs on it. And you're protecting industries, but you're only protecting certain industries. So it's not a fair or equal system across the board by any means. So I think in this, you know, as we're coming into these new times where there is a lot of disruption and a lot of change and a lot of geographical, you know, you're hanging on to these geographical boundaries and these kind of, you know, area systems. And it's like, if you really want to get crazy, you know, you really could start taking those apart. You could dismantle it. I mean, it's an extra tax, but is there another way to find that revenue? Absolutely. And it really just, it's fixated on borders and kind of locking people into a certain area. And again, like I just said at the beginning, protecting specific industries that got really organized, you know, like 100 years ago. So is there a point where I'm kind of done with them, but that's my take.
Well, I think I also read that it discourages international free market and is harmful to global economies.
And I think there's certainly, you know, the conversation around trade itself and globalization maybe hasn't been as equitable for distributing wealth, or for, you know, it can create isolation for people who aren't necessarily participating in trade directly. But there are a lot of different mechanisms and better ones to kind of rebalance that and to make those shifts. And I don't think tariffs are always the be all and end all, even though they're kind of all we're talking about in the here and now. So.
Well, and I'll just add, you know, without diving into politics.
Sorry, Leah.
You know, tariffs are a tool, if you will, to be used for a broader political discussion. I mean, we're seeing that happening right now with the US and China, and tariff is a mechanism that's being used to bring up other topics. And sometimes that's an interesting diplomatic avenue, so to speak, to point to other issues. So I think, you know, Audrey's right that for consumers and, you know, businesses, tariffs can be frustrating, or if you're not one of these unique industries that have lobbied together to, you know, demand certain tariff regulations. But especially with technology advancing the way that it is, many of our trade agreements haven't been built in such a way that they address intellectual property, privacy, data protection, et cetera. So I think we're going to see more use of tariffs in unique ways that, maybe are not just for collecting taxes and revenue from the government, but are also used for other political ends.
Awesome. Irina, do you have anything to add here? I know you're waiting.
And I actually wasn't going to say anything because I am very politically driven in my view of tariffs. But I do want to say, for any consumers out there who might be listening to this discussion who are not supply chain inclined, It's worth noting that the consumer, especially in the low value goods market, it was just consumer packaged goods mostly, the consumer is the one paying for those tariffs. It's nobody else, right? So like as any company that I've ever worked in that imports product that has tariffs on it, we will always build that cost into the cost of the product that's put on the market.
Yeah.
So we should at least as consumers be educated enough to understand that. China's not paying for those tariffs.
No.
That's all I have to say about it.
Yeah, great point.
Good point. Okay. So last but not least, our last hot topic is business planning and using your supply chain as a competitive advantage. Irina, this one is for you because, and actually I've been talking about this a lot, using supply chain as a competitive advantage because it is a competitive advantage. And not enough companies, I think, are really looking at it that way. I recently read an article from the Balance SMB by Gary Marion. I just want to make sure that I'm, calling out the people that I've done the research with. And he said the optimized supply chain definition is getting your customers what they want, when they want it, and spend as little money as possible getting it done, which I thought was pretty insightful.
Yeah,
so
that's the goal.
Yeah. Well, and I think in, that supply chain philosophy, that supply chain strategy, there's a lot of costs involved, obviously. That's why we used to be called the cost center. And now people are looking at it differently. But, there's really good examples, and I'll get into one a little bit later. But I think Zara is a really good example of using your supply chain as a competitive advantage. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think that, just to kind of bring the conversation all the way back around, the next generation is very brand loyal. And what I mean when I say, and I'm a very strong believer of supply chain as competitive advantage, because I think that it's the last mile that we can absorb within a business to grab that consumer from the time that they're interacting with a brand, whether that be from a social media or from a physical interaction with it, all the way until they physically open that package and they're delighted with their experience, right? The customer acquisition cost for any business has gone up. And so when we grab that consumer all the way until they press buy and then don't deliver properly on that last mile, and I don't just mean the last mile of delivery, meaning that the package is dropped off. I mean the last mile of interaction, right? And that's where supply chain owns that business, and that is where we can ruin all of the investment that we've made up until that point into the customer acquisition. And so supply chain actually needs to understand what customer acquisition costs look like, which is why I go back to we need to collaborate with the marketing and the sales teams to really understand what do those metrics mean to you, what can they mean to us, and how do we improve that together? Because, and I go back to saying, we are brand loyal and we are growing more and more towards that. Mm-hmm. So we need to be more aggressive about utilizing all of the tools and the supply chain tools that we have at our fingertips to be more strategic in the way that we interact and delight the customer.
Yeah, if anybody is listening to this from a marketing team, go and say hi to your supply chain team. Get the conversation started.
Yeah.
No, I think it's a good point, and I think it also kind of references what we talked about earlier, which is this idea of how do you leverage unique partnerships. Mm-hmm. And I think that issue around brand loyalty is really critical. And so looking for partners that are part of the same philosophy, that are coming into the space with the same mindset, allows you to speak to your consumer in a way that benefits your supply chain potentially. So I think it's a really good point, and is a really important insight that obviously Irina and her marketing team have had some sort of conversation, because I don't think that's a universal thought that most supply chain, folks are considering. What is our marketing message? What is our brand proposition? And what do we want that customer engagement to look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, Irina, you and I talked about you going to a marketing conference.
Yeah, I do that. I go to the weirdest conferences, and my colleagues are always like, "Why are you here?" And it's like, because I need to know what you guys are talking about. Because the likelihood of them coming to my desk and saying, "Hey, I went to this conference, I learned this, I'd like to implement it," not going to happen. It's just we're not set to do that. So sometimes it's incumbent, if we want to be the movers and the shakers, then we need to bring the conversation to the table. So
yeah, don't wait for the C-suite to say, "Hey guys, marketing needs to talk to supply chain."
When has that ever happened?
Audrey?
To jump in, I mean, and that works that's an e-commerce. It also works, I mean, we do a lot of business to business deliveries, and it's the same thing. If I mess up a delivery, like I mess up that sale, and then that's all that's all my salesperson will hear about is how it was late, how you didn't interact with our receiving department in the way we want you to, how you didn't follow them. You don't want that. You don't want to be the person who causes that. So it's, for me, my role is a customer service role, even though I'm logistics and compliance. So it's key for me to really understand how everything is going to get delivered and understand what, some customers have tolerance for, a late delivery and some don't. You've got to figure out who they are and prioritize accordingly. So, I mean, it's for your direct to consumer business, and it's for your business to business as well. So it's key.
And talking about costs, right? I mean, if we look at it as a business planning tool, all of the costs that come out of supply chain could be mitigated, could be lowered just by the different teams talking to each other. And I think that's what organizations really need to understand is that, yes, we're a cost center, but we're only as good as the tools that we have and the information that we have and what's shared with us.
But so I guess just to leave it at this, like from my perspective, we're not a cost center. We're an investment center. We are the business's investment into the consumer interaction with the product, right? Like supply chain buys the product, supply chain designs the box and chooses the corrugate and brings it into the country and stores it. And so nowhere in that chain, if you really look at it, is there a cost. It's actually an investment to get the product into the customer's hands or the service into the customer's hands. So we just maybe need to relabel these things that we not be looking at properly.
Change that mindset. Right? Well, and I think you also bring up a good point. I mean, we're a part of every single process, right? So when you're sourcing the product, depending on where it's coming from, what it's made of, is going to affect the landed cost here, which is going to affect the price to the consumer.
Yeah, and including which port you bring it in through, right? Like sitting in San Diego, I could bring it in through Ensenada, Mexico, and do some sub-assembly there. Bring it in through Vancouver, do some sub-assembly there. Bring it in through Long Beach, do no sub-assembly. Like there's a lot of different ways to look at it. And so it's like, yeah, it is. It's an investment in what is the best way to get the consumer to interact with the business.
Yeah. Well, and even the packaging, right? It comes down to even just the packaging, because if the packaging is humongous or if it weighs a lot, it's going to cost more to deliver, right?
And those are all tough considerations from a smaller business perspective. When I think about our small companies who are tackling the excitement of having a foreign customer suddenly, and they think they're going to break into a new market. And so this idea of business planning and being strategic around how you prepare for all this stuff. Audrey mentioned earlier, you don't have to do it by yourself. It's really overwhelming. A lot of it is unknown until you get that first, notice that you've done something wrong. But these are all those times where it really points out how critical your planning is. And if you don't know, you can come to folks like us and we'll be happy to help you with that. But yeah, planning is essential.
Well, I think that was great. I think that's a really good wrap up to this episode. I want to thank Irina for joining us as our guest on the first episode of the Trade Squad. I hope you've learned a lot. I hope we've been able to cover the hot topics for you. And we will see you on the next episode where we're going to be talking to somebody else. And I'm not going to mention who because we're going to make it a surprise and we're going to debate some new hot topics from there. But thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.